The Nvidia RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 are both powerful gaming graphics cards, but which should you pick, and is it worth upgrading? In this video, we'll check out a heap of game benchmarks at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p, at all setting levels to help you see the performance difference between them. For testing, I'm using the MSI 2080 Duke, which actually has a little overclock out of the box. I've got a full review on that if you're after more information. The 1080 on the other hand is my EVGA for the Win 2, which also has a slight overclock over the reference specs. Let's just quickly take a look at how the 2080 and 1080 differ in terms of specs. Note that things like clock speed and power will vary between specific cards. These are just the reference specs for each model, with the speeds of my specific cards in brackets. Important differences to note are that the 2080 has more CUDA cores, but lower base and boost clock speeds out of the box. They both have the same sized 8GB memory, although the 2080 has newer GDDR6 memory, which is faster. Just before we get into the gaming benchmarks, let's check out the system that was used for testing. I've got an Intel i7 8700K CPU overclocked to 5.1 GHz on all cores in order to best attempt to remove CPU bottlenecking, as well as 16GB of memory running at DDR4 2666 in dual channel. All tests were run with the same Windows and game updates applied, however different Nvidia drivers were used, as the RTX cards launched with a newer driver, and I retested my 1080 card a few days before the release of the drivers. Given I've already compared the 2080 against the 1080 Ti and found that both were fairly similar, I expect the 2080 to come out a fair bit ahead. With all of this in mind, let's check out the gaming results. Fortnite was tested with the same replay. At 1080p, we're getting excellent frame rates with either card, although the 2080 was performing 25% better at epic settings, a pretty big difference. Moving up to 1440p, the frame rates dropped down a bit, but still pretty good performance for the most part. The 2080 is still performing 24% better at epic settings in this test. At 4K, the frame rates at higher settings dropped down quite a bit, although with the 2080 we're still able to average 60 FPS at epic settings. And the 2080 was around 23% better than the 1080 now. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested with the built-in benchmark. At 1080p, the 2080 moves further ahead of the 1080 as we step up in settings. At the highest settings, the 2080 is 25% ahead of the 1080. At 1440p, the frame rates are still pretty decent with both cards, but there's a larger 30% difference between the two now, although the 1080 was still able to average over 60 FPS here. At 4K, you'll probably need to use lower settings for a good experience. At the highest settings, the 2080 is now 35% ahead of the 1080, and a much higher 46% improvement at the lowest settings. However, keep in mind there will be newer drivers for this game as it's new. Assassin's Creed Origins was also tested with the built-in benchmark. The results were pretty good for this intensive test, and the 2080 was 13% ahead of the 1080 at max settings. Stepping up to 1440p, the results are still pretty good for this test. And the 2080 is now performing 25% better than the 1080 in terms of average frame rates at max settings, with the 1% low of the 2080 almost ahead of the 1080's average. At 4K, the lower settings are performing quite a bit better than the higher ones, and at max settings, the 2080 was now scoring 32% ahead of the 1080. Far Cry 5 was again tested with the built-in benchmark, and at 1080p, we're seeing the smallest difference between the two cards out of the games tested so far, just a 9% boost with the 2080 at ultra settings. At 1440p, this rises quite a lot, with the 2080 now 23% ahead of the 1080 with ultra settings, and the same 23% increase was also seen with low settings. At 4K, the difference between the two cards rises further still, with the 2080 now performing 28% better than the 1080 at ultra settings, and the 1% lows of the 1080 are ahead of the 1080's averages at all setting levels. Ghost Recon was once again tested with the built-in benchmark, and as a more intensive game, the frame rates at ultra settings aren't that high even at 1080p. However, the 2080 was still 22% ahead of the 1080. At 1440p, the 2080 is still able to average 60 FPS at ultra settings in this test, and was now performing 23% better than the 1080, again with 1% lows above what the 1080 could average. At 4K, the difference between the two rises further, with the 2080 now 27% ahead of the 1080 at ultra settings. Although the frame rates are fairly low now, and lower settings would definitely be needed to play well. Overwatch was tested in the training area while running through the same route. At 1080p, the results are very nice. As the game caps out at 300 FPS, we're able to hit this at most setting levels. Although at max settings, the 2080 was 17% of the 1080. Going up to 1440p saw the same 17% increase with the 2080 over the 1080 at epic settings. Still extremely high results and running with no problems. At 4K, the difference between both cards at max settings was again 17%, same as the other settings tested. And the frame rates with both cards were still decent, definitely playable at 4K. It felt smooth, as even the 1080 had 1% lows above 60 FPS. CSGO was tested with the Uletical benchmark, and at 1080p the frame rates regardless of setting level were very high, with the 2080 10% ahead of the 1080 with all settings maxed out. At 1440p this increases to a 15% improvement with the 2080 at max settings, but again the results from both cards are fairly high in this test. At 4K the frame rates are still quite high, and at max settings the 2080 pushes further ahead of the 1080 at 17.5% now. Rainbow Six Siege was tested with the built-in benchmark, and we're seeing very high frame rates here, especially with the 2080, which was a large 32% improvement over the 1080 at ultra settings at 1080p. At 1440p, the frame rates are still very high, even at max settings, but the 2080 is now 41% ahead of the 1080 at ultra settings. At 4K, the 1% lows with the 2080 are ahead of all the 1080's results, with the 2080 now a high 47% better in terms of average frame rates than the 1080 at ultra settings. PUBG was tested using the replay feature. At 1080p, the frame rates are quite high, considering this is a pretty unoptimized game, and there was a decent 29% improvement with the 2080 at ultra settings. At 1440p, this rises a fair bit, with the 2080 now averaging 40% higher frame rates than the 1080 at ultra settings, and the frame rates at all settings with either cards are decent for this game. At 4K, the 2080 is still quite ahead of the 1080, with the 1% lows of the 2080 above the averages of the 1080, with the 2080 being 36 higher in average frame rates at ultra settings. Shadow of War was tested with the built-in benchmark, and at 1080p there was a 28% improvement when maxed out using the 2080. At 1440p, the 2080 is again ahead in all tests, rising up to 36% higher than the 1080 at ultra settings at this resolution. At 4K, the performance of the 2080 rises further ahead, up to 40% better than the 1080 now, and still fairly high frame rates at this high resolution at the lower setting levels. Watch Dogs 2 is quite a resource-intensive game, and there were very minimal differences at 1080p, as we appear to be CPU bottlenecked for the most part, with just a small 2% improvement with the 2080 at ultra settings. At 1440p, the differences between the two rise quite a lot at the higher setting levels, with the 2080 performing 35% better than the 1080 at ultra, although minimal differences at the lower settings. At 4K, the 2080 is still performing 30% better over the 1080 at ultra settings. And like we saw in the other games, even the 1% lows with the 2080 were ahead of the 1080's averages. I've also tested some benchmark tools. In Unigine Superposition benchmark, the 2080 was ahead in all tests, with the difference lowering at the higher levels. In the various 3D Mark benchmarks, the 2080 was again always ahead, although some tests were closer together than others. In terms of improvement, over all the games tested at max settings with a 1080p resolution, on average the 2080 was performing 19.6% better than the 1080 between the games tested. At 1440p, on average over the same games, the 2080 was now performing 28.4% better than the 1080 in these titles. But again, it really depends on the specific game. At 4K, the 2080 was on average 30.2% better than the 1080, a similar improvement that I saw when comparing the 1080 against 1080 Ti previously, which makes sense as the 2080 performs very closely to the 1080 Ti. The performance difference between the two cards rises on average at the higher setting levels, as there's less chance of a CPU bottleneck and the differences between the GPUs starts to shine. It's also worth noting the differences in my actual cards that I'm testing with. Both my 2080 and 1080 are overclocked out of the box, as previously mentioned, so this will slightly affect the results, although it would be quite negligible. Either way, the 2080 is way ahead of the 1080, and that fact won't change regardless of the specific card in use. If you want to see overclocking results, check out the full review of the MSI 2080 Duke, link in the description. I also haven't actually been able to test any RTX specific titles or settings, as there aren't any at the time of recording. So once RTX is actually utilised more in the future, the 20 series may become more useful. But I suppose the testing here makes the comparison more apples to apples, as we're testing the same game settings. Now for the final difference, the price. I suggest checking updated prices using the links in the description, as they will change over time. My 2080 Duke from MSI that I'm testing with is around $830 at the time of recording, but the 2080 prices seem to range from $750 to $900. The 1080 on the other hand can be picked up for around $450 to around $600 or $700 for a higher end model, and that's forgetting the second-hand market, which has a lot of deals at the moment due to ex-miners selling off cards. So which graphics card would you pick? The older but still capable GTX 1080? Or newer RTX 2080? Although the 2080 was a fair bit ahead of the 1080 in these games, the 1080 Ti still performs closely to the 2080, as I found out in my 2080 vs 1080 Ti video, link in the description. In that video, I noted that the 1080 Ti was cheaper than the 2080, meaning the 1080 Ti was offering better value, though this could of course change in the future. It pretty much seems like in the 20 series, the tiers have just been shuffled over one spot, as the 1080 Ti is quite similar to the 2080. I suspect that the 1080 will perform close to the soon-to-be released 2070, but we'll have to test that in a future video once it's released. In any case, I think it's more likely someone would be looking at the performance differences between the 1080 and 2080 from the perspective of already upgrading from their 1080, in which case I'd suggest looking at the 1080 Ti instead, as the 2080 is just so expensive at the moment, unless you really want to take the gamble today on ray tracing and DLSS technologies being the future. Personally, I'm more than happy with the performance of my 1080 and I won't be doing anything. But I hope that this video has shown you the differences to expect between the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 graphics cards. Let me know which card you'd pick down in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for future tech videos like this one.